The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 4 bipartisan measures. As all members were notified earlier this week, to expedite our consideration of these non-controversial items, we will take up en bloc the text previously provided to your offices, which all members have before them. And so without objection, the following items are considered as read and will be considered en bloc. H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. House Resolution 131 concerning the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The bipartisan amendment in the nature of a substitute to House Resolution 131 offered by Congresswoman Bass. House Resolution 273 expressing the sense of the House that the President should nominate an Inspector General of the Department of State and Broadcasting Board of Governors. House Resolution 222, recognizing the long-term partnership and friendship between the United States and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and the bipartisan amendment in the nature of a substitute to House Resolution 222 offered by Mr. Meeks. All members may have 5 days to submit statements for the record on any of today's measures. And after recognizing myself and the ranking member for brief opening remarks, I will be glad to recognize any committee members seeking recognition to speak on any of these measures. I am a strong supporter of House Resolution 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. Subcommittee Chairman Smith has worked hard on this bill, and over the years, this committee has held many hearings on Vietnam. If these hearings have had one consistent theme, it's the deterioration of human rights there in Vietnam. Government thugs brutalize peaceful dissidents. Anyone who dares to block or publish material on democracy or anything critical of the Communist Party faces years in jail and faces physical abuse. We need to send a message to the government, a message with teeth, and this bill does just that, and I strongly urge its passage. With regard to House Resolution 131, Congresswoman Bass has been dogged in bringing attention to the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and just last week the State Department announced former Senator Russ Feingold as Special Envoy for the Great Lakes, in part at her urging. Too many people have died. Too many people continue to suffer. The conflict in the DRC has lasted decades. Patience with this peacekeeping operation is wearing thin. We expect all regional leaders to respect and abide by the negotiated frameworks. House Resolution 273 expresses the sense of the House that the President should nominate a State Department Inspector General without delay. For months, on a bipartisan basis, the ranking member and I have called on the Administration to fill the vacant Inspector General position for the Department of State and Broadcasting Board of Governors. We've written to the President. We've written to Secretary Kerry, stressing the importance of appointing a permanent Inspector General. I raised it at our hearing with the Secretary. It's been 2,000 days since a permanent IG was last in place. It is time for this vacancy to be filled. IGs are the government's internal watchdogs. They police agencies for waste, for fraud, and for abuse. The resolution is nonpartisan for the simple reason that the concept of a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed permanent IG is fundamental to the very notion of good government. Lastly, House Resolution 222 recognizes the long-term partnership and friendship between the United States and the Kingdom of Jordan. The committee recently hosted the King of Jordan. Jordan continues to be a critical voice of moderation in the region. It's a key partner for peace. Today, Jordan has worked to address the needs of 550,000 Syrian refugees, which have poured across its borders in the last 2 years. This has resulted, by the way, in a 10% population increase for Jordan. This is seriously straining Jordan, and Mr. Meeks' resolution notes the mutual benefits of a strong U.S.-Jordan relationship. I hope the committee will support all of these measures, and I now recognize my good friend, the ranking member, for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling today's markup on these 4 bipartisan measures. And this goes in line with the way you and I have both tried to run this committee in the most bipartisan way possible. I'll just make some brief comments about each one of these. H.R. 1897, introduced by our colleague Chris Smith, addresses the troubling human rights situation in Vietnam. Despite the country's increased economic freedom, religious and political freedoms for Vietnamese citizens remain severely limited. The bilateral relationship between Washington and Hanoi has improved since diplomatic relations were established over 15 years ago, but the lack of greater progress in protecting basic rights and civil liberties in Vietnam remains a barrier to closer cooperation in the future. HRS 131, introduced by Karen Bass, draws critical attention to the ongoing situation in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I might say to the ranking member on the Africa Subcommittee, I appreciate her earnest involvement in all these very, very important issues. Violence continues to plague this region, with thousands of people displaced, dying of disease, suffering from rampant sexual abuse, and living with constant uncertainty about their futures. This resolution calls for a comprehensive approach to the crisis that addresses the root causes of the conflict and includes the active participation of all stakeholders, including the governments of countries in the Great Lakes region, the UN, and the U.S. Both the UN and the State Department have appointed special envoys for the region, and the UN recently deployed additional peacekeepers with a mandate to be more aggressive in responding to armed rebel movements. I hope that some of these actions will change the dynamic in eastern Congo and allow the people of the region to finally live in peace. Mr. Chairman, I'd especially like to thank you for your leadership in introducing HRS 273, which calls for the nomination of a permanent Inspector General for the State Department. I've been happy to work with you on this issue over the last several months and to be an original co-sponsor of this resolution. I know we share the view that having a permanent IG in place will help ensure independent and robust oversight at the State Department and the Broadcasting Board of Governors. I have now been informed that Secretary Kerry and President Obama identified a candidate for the state IG position back in April. The vetting process for that candidate is nearly complete, and the Secretary expects the nomination to be finalized and made public in the very near future. I know we all look forward to that announcement, and I'm proud of the role that this committee has played in helping that to get closer and closer. Finally, HRS 222, introduced by my friend from New York, Mr. Meeks, highlights the long-term strategic relationship between the United States and Jordan, which has been one of the few pillars of stability and peace in the Middle East. We all had the pleasure of meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan. This committee did just several weeks ago, and I know that we listened to him intently. He's always such a breath of fresh air, but a breath of realistic air, and tells us what we should be doing, and as far as I'm concerned, he's right on the money. Regional events such as transition in Egypt and war in Syria have put unprecedented stress on the Jordanian economy and society. Jordan is currently overflowing with refugees, and its already limited resources are strained. At this moment in time, Jordan needs support from the United States more than ever. This important resolution commends the people and government of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan for their continued friendship with the United States and commitment to peace, security, and stability. It also praises the government of Jordan for its response to the Syrian humanitarian crisis by hosting and caring for refugees fleeing violence instigated by the Assad regime in Syria. And finally, the resolution expresses a firm commitment to support the government of Jordan as it faces regional challenges and works toward a more peaceful and stable Middle East. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you again for holding this markup, and I look forward to supporting this package of measures. I yield back.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Mr. Engel for his remarks and also his contributions to these measures here today. Do any members seek recognition to speak on the en bloc amendments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do.
Ross-Lake,
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you for your great leadership on this committee, and thank you to Mr. Engel for forging this warm working relationship. I'm pleased to support these 4 bipartisan bills that are being marked up and considered en bloc by the committee today. I commend my good friend Mr. Smith for his unending support for human rights across the globe. I fully support his bill, H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act, a bill that promotes freedom and democracy in Vietnam. The United States is the world's leading expert when it comes to living up to these 2 ideals, yet too often we find ourselves sending money to governments that deny their citizens even the most basic human rights without leveraging that assistance to push for change to the status quo. One of the most important provisions of his bill would condition aid to Vietnam unless it meets certain specific requirements to improve its respect for human rights. This is an important way by which the United States can push for real reforms within countries like Vietnam, and I fully support this measure. We also have before us another important resolution on human rights. The humanitarian and military crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo has been ongoing for far too long and has claimed the lives of over 5 million people, while millions more have been displaced. The human rights violations that have occurred are unspeakable. I commend Ms. Bass and Mr. Smith for their Resolution 131, which is a step in the right direction at helping the people of the DRC by addressing several of the issues that must be resolved in order to help end this crisis, and I fully support this measure. And we also have a resolution before us, Mr. Chairman, which you have authored with our friend Ranking Member Engel, which urges the President to nominate a qualified and independent individual to fill the Inspector General slot at the State Department. I pressed this issue when I was chair, held a hearing focused directly on the need for the State Department to have an Inspector General that challenges the management of the State Department to function with transparency and accountability. I've been concerned, as many of us here have been, that this important watchdog position has been vacant for 5 years now, and it is imperative that the President fill this slot post haste. And finally, we have a resolution recognizing the partnership and friendship of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Jordan is a great friend and an important ally to the United States. Our bilateral relationship is stronger now than it has ever been. But with the ongoing crisis in Syria and Jordan having to bear such a heavy burden as it takes hundreds of thousands of those who fled Syria to seek refuge in a safer place, it is vital that we reaffirm our support for Jordan, and we must do what we can to help Jordan as it copes with the struggles that it is facing today. This resolution is an important way to announce to Jordan and to the world that we stand firmly and resolutely with our ally, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. I fully support this and all of the measures before us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again for your leadership.
Thank you. Congresswoman Bass is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you, one, for all of the work that's happened on the committee so far, and I wanted to speak in support of all 4 resolutions, but specifically in H.R. 131. And wanted to thank the ranking member and also Chairman Smith for his long-standing leadership on this issue. All of us know that the crisis in the Congo has gone unresolved for so many years. We've seen numerous declarations and agreements for peace, yet too little has been done to prevent the death of millions and the displacement of those forced to flee their homes and livelihood. I'm pleased that this bipartisan bill has many, many co-sponsors who've also registered their strong support to end the status quo. Over the last several months, I'm pleased to report that we've seen the United Nations appoint a special envoy to the DRC, former Irish President Mary Robinson, and last week, Secretary Kerry appointed former Senator Russ Feingold as the UN Special Envoy to the DRC, and that's one of the things that the resolution was calling for, was the appointment of that Special Envoy. I had the opportunity to speak to Senator Feingold yesterday, and I'm sure that the Chair and Ranking Member has also, and I think it might be a great idea down the line after he's had a chance to settle in if we would ask him to come and give us a report to the committee. In February, the Congolese, joined by other Great Lakes nations as well as the UN and African Union, committed to an agreement that, with the strong support from the international community, hopefully will finally lead to peace and stability. This committee has the opportunity and responsibility to send a clear message that the ongoing crisis in the DRC has not been forgotten in this chamber or in the U.S. Congress. It's time for the crisis in the DRC to come to an end, and I really appreciate my colleagues' support in our efforts to end this tragedy. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass, and thank you for your efforts on this issue. And I do think you're right. I think we need to hear from Special Envoy Feingold, and so we will ask him to meet with the committee and have a joint meeting with him. Thank you. Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, want to speak out for all four of the bills that are in block. I want to thank, of course, Chairman Smith for his hard work and continuing to fight every day to try to make sure that human rights are seen all over the world. I think that it really stands out very clearly that we're all related, we're all human, and you want to make sure that we all receive the same. And I want to thank you for your hard work on this. And of course, my colleague Karen Bass for all that she's doing, just whispering here with Mr. Connolly, who's saying how very seriously that Ms. Bass has taken the responsibility as the ranking member on the Africa Subcommittee and making a real difference in doing it. So thank you in your bill. And of course, Mr. Chairman, what you and Ranking Member Engel is doing, not only in this bill, but the way that you've been conducting this committee in a bipartisan way, and everyone having an opportunity to contribute and to make a real contribution and to feel that you really belong and being a part of this in a bipartisan way. You're really setting an example, and the way that you two work with one another is tremendously important. So I want to thank you in that regards. And I want to just make my references specifically to HRES 222 and thank the committee and appreciate the support of over 35 colleagues as co-signers of this resolution, and of course including you, Mr. Chairman, and the Ranking Member Engel, and 16 members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. This resolution recognizes the long-term partnership and friendship between the United States and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, working together towards peace and security in the Middle East. This bipartisan resolution comes at a crucial time and a critical time of unrest and conflict in the region. This resolution is particularly timely today as Secretary of State John Kerry arrives in Amman to begin a new round of peace talks. Jordan plays a critical role as a mediator of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Jordan's normalized relations and historic 1994 peace treaty with Israel greatly contributes to stability in the region. And Jordan is an advocate for progress in the Middle East peace process and often offers to host peace negotiations as a mediator. The United States has a close relationship with Jordan spanning over 60 years, and we work side by side with Jordanians in multiple areas, from security cooperation and counterterrorism to economic development and humanitarian assistance. This resolution is not simply recognition of that friendship, it is a reaffirmation of the importance of the United States and Jordan's partnership as a key element of U.S. strategic interest in the Middle East. The horrific violence in neighboring Syria is threatening to destabilize an entire region. Jordan has worked closely with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to host an increasing number of refugees. According to the UNHCR, Jordan is currently hosting approximately 500,000 refugees, and the number increases with each passing day. The number of refugees in Jordan accounts for almost 8% of the Jordanian population. This is a heavy burden for Jordan that cannot be underestimated. And I am pleased to recognize the friendship between the American people and the people of Jordan working towards peace and security in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield.
Would my colleague yield?
I yield.
I thank my colleague for yielding. I just want to add my voice to his and my other colleagues in supporting the legislation before us today. I'm particularly proud of being an original co-sponsor of the Vietnam Human Rights Act, where human rights violations continue. And I am pleased to support the legislation in front of us. And I want to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member and echo your sentiments about the bipartisan manner in which they have conducted the business of this committee. With that, I yield back to my colleague.
I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly and Mr. Meeks. We go to Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, want to thank you and the Ranking Member, Elliot Engel, for the way you've conducted this committee and working in a very robust bipartisan manner. And I support all four of the bills that are under consideration. I do want to thank you especially for bringing the Vietnam Human Rights Act again before the committee. On 2 previous occasions, we brought this to the floor of the House. It passed overwhelmingly. There were people who said things were improving in Vietnam, and of course the record, and we had a hearing on June 4th, clearly shows that there has been significant deterioration. Human Rights Watch testified and pointed out on June 4th that in the first few months of 2013, more people have been convicted in political trials as in the whole of last year, in all of 2012. They pointed out how the trend lines have been worsening and that the governance by Vietnam is characterized by brutality and systematic suppression of freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. We heard at our hearing from a Vietnamese woman who was forced to work in a brothel in Russia with 14 other Vietnamese women. Last year we heard at another hearing about a group of Vietnamese workers who were trafficked to Jordan. In each of these cases, and they're only a tip of the iceberg, officials from the Vietnamese government not only failed to assist the victims, but instead were directly complicit in this egregious exploitation of women. We also heard from a number of people from the Christian and Khmer Krom Buddhist monks who testified before the committee and told how each of their belief groups were being systematically harassed and imprisoned and even forcibly told they must renounce their faith, particularly the Montagnard. It's imperative that the United States government send an unequivocal message to the Vietnamese regime that it must end its escalating human rights abuses of its own citizens. And this legislation seeks to do that by setting out very clear and very attainable benchmarks and calls for substantial progress in respecting freedom of religion, releasing all religious prisoners, respecting the rights of freedom of expression, assembly, and association, and releasing all political prisoners, independent journalists, and labor activists, repealing and revising laws that criminalize peaceful dissent, independent media, unsanctioned religious activity, so-called unsanctioned, and nonviolent demonstrations in accordance with human rights standards, and of course respecting the human rights of all ethnic groups and taking all appropriate steps, including prosecution of government officials to end government complicity in human trafficking. I would note parenthetically the first case that was brought against Vietnamese officials pursuant to legislation that I authored in 2000, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was against Daewoosa, which had a sweatshop in American Samoa, and the Vietnamese government to this day has not honored the findings of that court, which held very high officials to account. Matter of fact, they were promoted in Vietnam to higher positions. So very serious human rights situation. In a bipartisan way, we're trying to address it. I also want to thank you for bringing to the committee Ranking Member Karen Bass's resolution, H.Res. 131, as amended with the amendment in nature of a substitute. We've had several hearings on the DR Congo. I, like other members, have been there. I've been to Goma and seen how horrific the abuse there is. And this calls upon not only the DR Congo, but other border states to do far more than they have done to end the atrocities and the violence there. It also points out that the Atrocities Prevention Board, created in 2011 to coordinate U.S. policy to prevent mass atrocities and serious human rights violations, work with regional and international partners to help bring the tragedy of life in Eastern Congo to a definitive end. The Atrocities Prevention Board is directed to address, prevent, and ensure accountability for serious violations of humanitarian law, and we're calling on them to do far more than we think that they have done so far. So, very fine resolution, and again, in a bipartisan way, I'm glad to join Karen Bass as a co-sponsor of her bill.
Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also say thank you to the Chairman and the Ranking Member for the leadership on this committee and the bipartisan way we approach all of the issues we face. I am proud to fully support all 4 resolutions, and I'm grateful as well for the leadership of many on this committee in speaking out and acting on human rights and oversight, and let me focus in particular on Jordan. H.Res. 222, recognizing the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, for its long partnership with the United States, its commitment to peace and security in the region, its leadership and promotion of peace with its neighbor Israel, and in particular at this moment, its contribution towards dealing with both political and humanitarian crisis in Syria is crucial. Jordan has been a U.S. ally for over 6 decades. Nearly 2 decades ago, Jordan signed a historic peace treaty with Israel, and has since, under the leadership of King Abdullah II, actively and constructively sought progress towards peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Jordan has been a reliable partner with the U.S., providing intelligence and resources in the global war on terror, as well as security and humanitarian support of United States efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of particular note, Jordan has been a refuge for people seeking security and sanctuary from sectarian violence in Iraq, Libya, and now most urgently, Syria. Already over 500,000 people have sought refuge in Jordan from the atrocities of the al-Assad regime, and some estimate that number may double before the end of the year. Jordan presently faces significant challenges in dealing with this massive refugee crisis and its associated economic burden. The U.S. can and must do more to assist the people and government of Jordan as the conflict in Syria continues to threaten the stability of the entire region. We must work in partnership with our allies in the region, including Jordan, to ensure the crisis in Syria does not break out into a broader regional disaster. The resolution we are considering today accurately identifies the tremendous assistance Jordan provides throughout the region and recognizes our partnership in promoting both security and peace. I yield back.
Mr. Barry, did you seek recognition?
I do. Yeah.
Oh, before we go to you, I think Mr. Rohrabacher just indicated he'd like to seek recognition.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to congratulate you on doing the drudge work of making sure that legislation gets put together and brought before us, and the compromises and the wordings and all of the things that go into your job. You're doing a good job for us, and especially on important issues like we are discussing today, and they are important. We're talking about human rights in Vietnam and in Africa, and acknowledging Jordan as a very important player in the Middle East and an important friend of the United States. I'd like to call attention specifically to the legislation and my name to it, if we could, that references human rights in Vietnam. The people of Vietnam deserve special attention. They deserve the special attention that this legislation gives them. We encouraged the Vietnamese people during the height of the Cold War to resist the expansion of communism. They did so. They did so bravely, courageously, and unfortunately their efforts were futile. We also, of course, lost 50,000 American lives and hundreds of thousands of wounded during that conflict in the 1960s. Let's remember, however, that the Vietnamese paid a much heavier price for that conflict, which was indeed one of the epic conflicts of the Cold War. And the Vietnamese, we of course, left the Vietnamese to fight on by themselves. And a few years after we left, and not that long after we left, they were, of course, overrun when this Congress decided to cut all funds off to the Vietnamese government that we'd left behind. We cut off all funds for any military support for a conflict that we had convinced them to get into in the first place. With this history, Mr. Chairman, I think it behooves us to try our best to at least be on the record and to pressure the government of Vietnam today to respect the human rights of its people to the degree that a government such as that government exists. It's hard to tell whether we can call them a communist government, as it's hard to tell whether or not the government in China is a communist government. But we do know that the government of China is the world's worst human rights abuser, and we do know that there are major human rights abuses going on in Vietnam. With this special relationship that we paid for and they paid for in blood, we do need to go on record strongly when their rights are being violated. One of the groups of people here being mentioned are the Montagnards. And I will have to note that back in 1967, I spent some time in the Central Highlands with the Montagnard villagers and found them to be courageous. And I'll never forget, they give these little bracelets out that go around your arm that means you're a member of their tribe or their clan, I guess. And I remember when they gave me one, and years later I determined that the war in Vietnam was not in our interest to stay and lose so many of our young lives. It was so divisive for our people. And I remember the day I decided that, I was in the shower, actually taking a shower, and that bracelet broke at exactly that moment. And I looked down, and that bracelet was in the drain. And I looked down and I said, I wonder what happened to those Montagnard people who trusted me and gave me that bracelet. Maybe they're going down the drain too. Well, today, and for the last few years, those of us who've tried to remain true to the principles of human rights that I think our country stands for, know that we need to pay, and we have a debt to pay to those people, to pay special attention to those human rights that were violated and are being violated today by that vicious government that still controls and holds power, although it's how they can claim they gave so many lives to create this Marxist dream, and there's no way they can claim that their economic system, as in China, has anything to do with Karl Marx, because it's now a ultra profiteering capitalist system. But it's more like a fascist system, we should say. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for, again, all of the legislation that you've worked through, especially this legislation that gives a very special attention to the Vietnamese people, to whom we owe a great debt. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We'll go now to Dr. Berra, but before I do, I'll remind the members we have competing markups, and members may submit statements for the record, and after we recognize our next few speakers, we're going to go to a voice vote as soon as all members seeking recognition we've complied with that request. And Dr. Berra, go ahead.
Absolutely. And I'll keep my comments brief. First off, I will speak in favor of all four of the resolutions. I also want to commend the chairman and ranking member for the nature of this committee. Things in this town don't always work very well, but this committee can be an example of what does work well by working together. I want to speak specifically to HRES 273, particularly in the timeliness of yesterday's hearing and the importance of getting the Broadcasting Board of Governors working. Anything we can do to move this process forward. It was disconcerting yesterday to hear how dysfunctional the board is, and that is an important piece of our strategic dialogue. It's an important piece of our diplomacy, and again, I speak in support of helping us move this process forward. So, with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Dr. Berra, thank you. We'll look forward to working with you on that question of reconstituting the Broadcasting Board of Governors so that it operates in an effective way. Were there, I think Mr. Lowenthal was seeking recognition. Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support all four measures before us today, but I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013, an act to promote freedom and democracy in Vietnam. First, I'd like to thank Congressman Smith for introducing this important legislation, and for you, Mr. Chair, for bringing it to the full committee. And I'd also like to thank you, Mr. Chair, for conducting this committee in a bipartisan manner. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act, could not have come at a more critical time for the United States-Vietnam relations. As we all know, that the government of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam has benefited substantially since the time that it normalized relations with the United States. Through its partnership with the United States, the government of Vietnam has gained access to the WTO, has received permanent normal trade status with our country, and has expanded into American markets, which is now worth approximately $25 billion a year. Now the government of Vietnam wants to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership without any commitment to respecting human rights, religious freedom, and political rights of its people. Despite the fact that Congress has passed numerous resolutions in the past calling on the United States government to pressure Vietnam into improving its human rights record, we seem to be gaining nowhere with progress on the ground. On the contrary, the government of Vietnam has stepped up its crackdown on activists, dissidents, and opposition voices in an unprecedented scale. This is due to the fact that increasingly intellectuals, former officials, and those who have worked for the ruling authorities are speaking out against the authoritarian regime and voicing their opinions for justice and for human rights. As reported by the Human Rights Watch on June 19th, blogger Trung Duy Nhat, blogger Pham Viet Dao, who is a former government official, and internet activist Win Chi Duc, a former member of the Communist Party, they have been recently arrested by the Ministry of Public Security just for exercising their rights. Moreover, bloggers such as Trung Duy Nhat, Pham Viet Dao have both been critical of the Vietnamese Prime Minister, Nguyen Thanh Young, and Vietnamese Communist Party Secretary General Nguyen Phu Thong. They have blamed them for mishandling the economy and calling for their resignation. It just goes on and on, Mr. Chair. Human rights abuses and crackdown on political dissidents are on the rise in Vietnam. While these activists represent the latest wave of crackdown on dissidents by the government, we should not also forget that many prisoners of conscience are still serving their long and unjust sentences from years ago, and they remain today in jail. It's with this heavy background of human rights abuses that I implore this Congress to pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013 to send a strong signal to the government of Vietnam to stand up for justice and human dignity. Just recently, on June 6th, I, along with Chairman Royce and Congresswoman Loretta Sanchez, and others, hosted a community town hall for the United States Ambassador to Vietnam, David Shear, in my district, which is the heart of Little Saigon in Orange County, which is one of the largest concentration of Vietnamese outside of Vietnam. The overwhelming number of Vietnamese Americans and local elected officials who attended the event called on Congress to pass the Vietnam Human Rights Act. Today I'm asking for the same. Freedom, democracy, and human rights must be a part of any future partnership with Vietnam. Let us support the people of Vietnam by voting yes on H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Do any other members seek recognition before we vote? Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on agreeing to the items being considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the items considered en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, the measures agreed to en bloc, H.R. 1897, House Resolution 131 as amended, House Resolution 273, and House Resolution 222 as amended, are ordered favorably reported to the House, and staff are directed to make technical and conforming changes. And I want to thank Ranking Member Engel and all of our colleagues for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee is adjourned.